It is a lovely afternoon. Thank you for being here with us as we look at a section in our Civics conversation. So as you know, my name is Carl, well, you may not know, my name is Carl Kreisman, and I have been privileged to lead the programming for these two series that the library puts on, connected to history. One of those past meets present, which is the opposite month of this, and then the other one, Civics, which we began in 2022 when we came back post-COVID. And so this topic today is about citizen civics, as you can sort of see right off the bat. Citizenship is, in my opinion, one of the challenging aspects for a person to grasp, and in my opinion, over the past, I'd say 20 years at least, maybe 25, we are living in a time when it is less well understood, or maybe better said, to be more fair, it is under greater discussion and debate for the definition. So everything exists around definitions, and one of the things, if you've lived long enough, you recognize words change their definition over time, culturally usually, very slowly. Some of us remember cool used to mean just one certain thing relative to weather, and then Happy Days and Fonzie changed all that, and it became something else. And we have other words that we recognize like that over time then either have multiple meanings or even mean something completely different in the process of how they mean. So let me dive in by taking us to maybe one of the seminal moments, in particular as we look ahead to this next year. One of our last slides, I will show you our upcoming schedule, in which the entire year we're going to sort of, in one sense, blend the Past Meets Present series and the Citizen Civics series into one series that focuses on the semi-quincentennial, the USA 250 anniversary, that will center obviously in July, but we're going to take the entire year. So far what I've seen in the country and in the city of Winter Park, here at the library, the focus is a January to July thing, but we're going to spend the entire year looking at either themes. So we're going to have the question of slavery in the Revolution, women in the Revolution, literature in the Revolution, as well as specific moments. So in January, we're going to have one of my peers come and talk about Thomas Paine and the writing of Common Sense, and what Common Sense meant, because it was in January of '76 that Thomas Paine published Common Sense with the help of Benjamin Rush. And so that kind of jumpstarts a key part of the journey. Obviously, our story begins pre-January of '76, but you get the point. And we'll look at some of the battles that occurred at certain times. We'll obviously spend July looking at the Declaration. Some of you have been here and you go, we've looked at the Declaration before. We're actually going to spend a large part of the time in that July. We're going to read it, and you're going to read it with me. You're going to help me. I'm going to ask each one of you to have a microphone and pass it around for you to help us read, because that's one of the key parts in my mind of what it meant to be, what they were trying to do, was this idea of a loose collection. It's not as broad as we like to think of it as today, or like we wish it to be today, or maybe that it is today, but nonetheless they were setting in motion a philosophical viewpoint which we've been allowed to not press further than they wanted necessarily, but certainly take and extend, so that it is multiple voices from multiple ethnicities, multiple people groups who then can read this document together. We're going to read it together, we're going to look at it, but that's July. Today we're going to be talking about what does it mean to be a citizen. So we're going to start in July of '76 with Mr. Jefferson. So some of this is very familiar to many of you. We've covered this ground in here, and hopefully you've studied in other places. Ken Burns is just about to release a new series. Actually, I think it's this Sunday that it's going to be on PBS, and then I'm sure after that it'll be around. So Jefferson was tasked, as you know, with the draftsmanship of the Declaration. John Adams and Ben Franklin, they were like the seniors on this school committee, and they're like, we don't want to do the work. Actually, what Jefferson said was, I don't write anything that somebody's going to be able to edit later. And what Adams said was, everybody hates me because I talk too much, so I don't want somebody else to do it. You're young, you haven't said 2 words the whole time, nobody knows who you are. In essence, nobody cares, but we all think you're kind of smart from what we've heard at the taverns, so you should write it. The 2 middle-class people, the sophomores and juniors, they didn't do anything the whole time. So Jefferson gets out to write it. As you know, it's a legal brief. The core part of it, we all know the preamble, and as Adams says there, the flights of oratory, but the core of it is that it's a legal document. It's like a lawyer laying out a case. Here's, Judge, why I should win my case, these following points. And the way we typically look at it, although if you try to count it, I'm not so sure it's as clean as everybody says it is, but there are 27 final things that are raised. And in the process of this, Jefferson lays out his 27. Now, his 27 and the final 27 are different. Some of you most famously know that Jefferson, this is the height of hypocrisy, but that fits Jefferson, that he claims slavery came from the king. It's like, okay, so, right, so you're a free citizen, so you could just end your part in it right now. But of course he wasn't going to do that. In any case, one of the ones that he did, and this was known but wasn't found in the way I'm about to show it to you until 2009. That's why historians love still digging around for stuff. In the Library of Congress, they did some work with imaging and kind of infrared imaging, because what they believed was true and had heard was true but didn't have the evidence for was that when Jefferson first wrote this complaint that he has incited treasonable insurrections of our fellow, he wrote subjects. It's right here. This is the actual, you can go to the Library of Congress page. In the draft that he showed to Adams and Franklin, and then the draft that went to the Congress and the Committee of the Whole, where they struck this out. They're like, no, we're not going to say all that. So that part's not even in there. But in this draft, he himself struck it out, and through a series of, there's no erasers, of course, through a series of writings over, it became our fellow citizens. Jefferson was centrally thinking that what we're talking about is a distinguishment from the normative state of most civic entities, in which, as I've told you before, the way I describe it here in my lectures and with my students and stuff, is that the normative way is like a power pyramid, where there's a few, sometimes singular, but usually a very few people at the top who have all the power. And there's no agency. Now you can say, we do that now, but we all still vote, so whether we're actually having our vote matter or not, we're going through the process. But I'm talking about historically, there's no voting. Nobody's asking people like you and me what we think. Nobody cares what you and I think. There's a very small group of people, sometimes one, sometimes a small little committee, who run the show. So that's the normative state. And in that normative state, you were subjects. And so Jefferson's obviously writing in that context. I am a subject, our fellow subjects. And then at some point he must have thought, well, no, that's not really what I want to say. That's not what we're trying to argue. That's not the place where we want to go. So this idea of citizenry and what it means to be a citizen is crucial for us to get our heads wrapped around. Again, one reason is because we attempt, and we're going to work our way through the time together till we get to our Constitution, and then we're going to look at what happened post-Constitution. We attempt to say that we are a government of the people. And so a government of the people begs the question, well, who? Which people? Right? So that's the question. Previously, it was never a government of the people, so it didn't matter, really, about that process. So this is kind of what we're going to kind of walk our way through, is to say, like, well, what does it even mean to be a citizen? I think right now, in the early 21st century, citizen definition is in dispute. And again, fair enough, because we change definitions as we go, but it will impact how you and I as citizens, I assume, in the United States, then think about our relationship as one of the people who supposedly is in control of the decision making, or at least has a voice into the decision making. So to get a running start, I want us to back up into antiquity, just so you can see this kind of played out. Again, I want to stress, citizen and being a citizen with some agency, which I'm going to lay out here in a minute, is not normative. That is not what is normally done. And arguably across the world today, you see that in question. Now, I think most countries today, I think last time I checked the UN, there's 190. Most of them have followed the United States and gone down this road. If you go into the French Revolution studying, you look at their 5,000 constitutions that they wrote in like 12 years, they keep arguing about what they want citizenry to be, and they redefine it and all this kind of stuff. But they're all kind of working today through this idea that they're citizens. As we're going behind the scenes, there should be in your mind the other word that I believe is in debate at this time in our nation, and I say this time, I mean for the past at least 30 years, is the question of what does it mean to be a nation? And as I've told you before, nation for me is really a synonym. It's one of many words we use. So back up from that and say what's really being asked is, what does it mean to be a civic entity that is identifiable, geographically constrained? What does that mean? Do we want that to be the case? Do we think that's useful? And I think there are some who would the answer to that question be no. That's why I've said we're kind of in a time where there is a large contingent of people who I believe are post-national. Their viewpoints is post-national, fair enough. They have some questions that have to answer about structure and payment and all that kind of stuff. For you and me, though, what this means is, how do I understand it? And so I'm saying all that about, again, citizen and about this word nation in order to help us think about it. I've told you this before, I'm just a little country redneck kid from Tennessee. I mean, I wore shoes and socks just for you. It's an easy way for me to understand it is to think of your house where you live. Your house is the nation. Who are the citizens of that house? And then the relationships you have with other people, you can work all those out in your head, kind of start thinking your way through it. How would you handle it? And when you think of, for me, when I think about that, it helps me really grasp some of the nuances of this question. All right, so let's go way back in time. Let's go to the Bible, actually, and we'll go to the 1st century of Rome, where we get this historical moment. There's a figure in the Bible, some of you may know, a man named Paul, and he was going around, traveling throughout the area, and he ended up in Jerusalem, in where he got crossways with some of his fellow Jews, and they had him seized and arrested. The police, the Roman authorities, for them, all I know is I've got a riot, and then this is the guy who seems to be at the center of it. He's grabbed. As a part of Roman jurisprudence, you could, if you wished, elicit testimony through force. And a way that you would do that is you would beat them. Not like hidden and secret and then the police are in trouble. Did you hit him? We don't know. And it's all this question. No. It's in the open. He's strapped down and the guy with the whip's twirling his lip, ready to go. And Paul, before it happens, so you kind of get the idea, he's down or maybe he's strapped up, and he just cocks his head and he says, is it legal for you to scourge a man who's a Roman citizen? And at that moment, the guy who's in it, he's all wound up, ready to do his job. He's like, whoa. He's like, he's looking around for his superior officer. He's like, what? Wait a minute. This guy just made a claim. Now, I'll beat him to death if he's lying, but wait a minute. So what's the claim? Not that he's Roman or that he's unfairly grabbed or that he had a legal right to be in this position, like he had a right to be in the temple, like these guys are liars. That's not his claim. His claim is singular. I'm a citizen. And by extension, I have rights connected to citizenship. Meaning, if he had been in the same spot and did not have Roman citizen status, he couldn't claim something. So my daughters can come into my house and make a claim because they're a citizen. Their friends cannot because they're not citizens. Their friends, I know them. Some of them we think of as adopted, children. But we haven't legally adopted them. They haven't legally rejected their own families. So they're not my citizen. Does that make sense? We see what he's claiming. This is important. So then, so you got a soldier. He turns to the centurion who's there going, dude, the centurion, you can just almost see him backing up, going, whoa, hang on. And so he goes and gets his superior officer, the tribune. He's like, dude, come out here. So then there's this conversation that we're told of. And the tribune goes, are you a citizen? Paul claims yes. Now you and I, as good historians, we want a little more details. Ancient sources never give us all the details we want. Modern sources don't give us all the details we want. So the tribune then is trying to check this out. I don't think the purchasing issue would have made a difference. But he's basically saying, I don't believe you, Paul. And he's like, I have proof because I bought mine. And so somewhere he would have had a paper documentation. And Paul's like, oh, no. I got blood right citizenship. My folks are citizens. And at that point, the tribune's like, we're done. He doesn't release him from custody, but he releases him from being beaten. And he's kind of put off to the side. And then if you read the rest of this, this is given to us by one of the preeminent first century historians. If you're interested in kind of Eastern Roman Empire, first century, first 4 or 5 decades under Octavian and Tiberius, one of the best historians to read is a physician named Luke. He wrote a 2-volume set about this time. I highly recommend it to you. And so he's born, and so they all back away, and he's, okay, all right, we're going to send you up. The tribune's like, you're going to go talk to the governor, because I don't know. This is above my pay grade, and I don't want to. And what could have happened, just so you know, the soldiers could have been executed. If they had beaten him without the right legal process, unlike today where we might have a police officer go to jail or sometimes just get a smack on the wrist. No, these guys could have been put to death. And so they're like, I ain't touching this. I don't know if he's lying or not. Somebody else got to figure that out. And again, if he's lying, we'll deal with it. But if he's not lying, I'm not going to be killed because you're mad and you want me to beat this guy. Again, the point for us in seeing this example is it all hinges on citizenship, which at this time in the world is a largely unknown concept. So I just kind of want to set that in motion for you as we go. What does it mean when we talk about citizenship? Now again, you can find other definitions, other people giving you different things, but this 3-step process here is really, for me, the core issue. So 1, identification. I'm from here. I'm not from somewhere else, and everybody else knows I'm from here. So my daughter's friends know where they're from. They're from that house. They're not from this other house. They're not from that house. They're from this house. And so they have identification in the process. They have privileges and protection because of the identification. Because I am from this place, therefore I am one of these, I have some privileges in here that nobody else has. You ever had a good friend? I had several like this, in which the parent had to tell me it's okay to get a drink, you don't have to ask me. And that was kind of a big deal. I could go into their refrigerator, rarely did because my mom would have found out and gotten mad at me. But nonetheless, Carl, you're one of us, you're allowed in here. But it had to be extended, right? Ever gone back to your parents' house? Ever, some of you who are older like me, had your children come back or grandchildren come back? Do they ask you, particularly the children, to get something out of the refrigerator or the pantry? If they did, when you look at them and go, what'd you just do? Well, I just wanted to check. You're my kid. This is your nation. You get privileges here. Your boyfriend you brought with you, or your husband, I don't know. We're still working on him. We're still thinking that one out. He's an in-law, right? And then lastly, participation in the governance. Obviously, the house metaphor breaks down here. Although some of you might recognize as your children got older, you did give them part of the family monthly funds, and then they might have had freedoms on that monthly funds. I mean, they didn't have to ask your permission. So they got to participate in things. Some of you might have included them in some decision making for vacations, for weekends, that kind of a thing. But again, it breaks down a little bit. So identification, I'm one of this place. Privileges and protections because of the identification, and then participation in, or we might even say agency in the civic structure of the way things work. So does that make sense for everybody? Okay, remember, you always ask me questions. Okay, so again, antiquity, not the case. Now you go way back in antiquity, before you really even have governance of any key thing, any significant moment, we're all families, which again is why I like the house metaphor. Most of what we consider a civic entity, when you look back in time, the Cherokee people, the Aztec people, the Caltech people, right? The Songhay people, they're a tribe. It may be very large, just like your family, if went far enough back and then came forward counting, may be very large. My dad was one of 12, his dad was one of 8, his dad was one of 7. So, you get the numbers going, you can see how that works out, right? And you get a larger and larger group of people. So tribally, the relationship, and you can see now one of the core ways that citizenship is connected, it's by blood. You are part of this tribe. But they never would have used the word citizen. They probably just would have thought of it as family. And then they would have called you out what you were, a cousin, a nephew, an uncle, an auntie. I mean, those kinds of different things would have been used. As you got larger and larger, so first in Egypt, then the city-states in the Mesopotamian Valley, over in the Indus Valley, over on the Yalu River, as you got larger and larger groups, you did begin to see some what you and I would consider civic structure building out. right? And so in that kind of moment, you then had a different category in which you were one who could identify from here, but that's the end of it, right? And there weren't really necessarily privileges. There might have been, but there weren't necessarily privileges. There was no participation. And so subject is perhaps the best word to use for the person who's there. Subject or conquered people. So a lot of times if you go back and you look and you examine different places, you'll find some places that geographically are extraordinarily large as our continent is now, or even larger in some cases. And yet most of the people there were conquered people. So they were in a kind of a whole different category, but they weren't, in most of the time, considered citizens. And again, they weren't involved in the governance. And so this is that power pyramid thing that I've described before in the process. For me, typically, sorry ladies, it's almost always men at the top, which, we'll figure that that's useful or not useful. And it's usually one of these four categories. Sometimes they're in partnerships. Rarely do you actually see the holy man running the show or the wise man running the show, but they're often the partner of the strong or the rich man, one or the other in that connection. But some combination of those, and then they run the show kind of making decisions. And then there is a small group. Sometimes we think of this in the Middle Ages, so you have like a king or a duke or a noble at the top, and then there's the nobility, particularly at a larger scale in the feudal system, that kind of all connect themselves together. But again, the 80-90% of us, we're down here. Nobody cares. Nobody's asking. Nobody really thinks you should have agency to participate in the process. And as you know, most of you, then there are two places that kind of go their own separate way. So we'll look at these really quickly. Again, here and maybe other places you've covered this. You've looked at this. One begins in the 620s, actually slightly before that. One in the 510s. Coming there, they have that we know of, that I know of at least, there's no connection between them. There's no passing of letters, there's no commentary, there's no ambassadors going back. Rome this looks like all of Rome. Don't think of it, Rome is Rome. If you've ever been to Rome, that's it. You've been in the nation of Rome when you walked in there, and that little tiny spot inside the 7 hills. It will grow, but the growth occurs after the governing decisions are made. Similarly, over here in Attica and the Peloponnese, this map's not as helpful because it only gives us the two. There are multiple city-states. Remember, one of the lessons from antiquity is that there's always kind of this pull, kind of a yin and yang, or a pendulum swinging, or I think more magnetic pull. Sometimes one pole is stronger than the other pole. Between the best governance is very large, and the best government is very small. Like, we would be better in the year 2025 if there was the United States of North America. And from the Panama Canal through Canada, we were one big, large nation. That's very large. We would be better if we were the nation of Winter Park. If Luxembourg can do it, we can do it. We'll be the nation of Winter Park, be a lot happier, a lot better off. And then all the Winter Parkians who hate the traffic will definitely put up walls and gates, and nobody gets to drive in here. If you drive on Fairbanks, screw you, go around. You can't come through unless you're one of us. Privileges and opportunities for citizenry. I live here. I can drive on Lakemont and Aloma into Fairbanks. You can't unless you got a blue road sign. You don't have a blue road sign, you're part of Orange County, you're a whole different nation. Get the hell out. Of course, they might say, okay, great, you never come into Disney. Some of us would wet our pants. Oh, no. Okay. So, let's look at the Greeks, right? And again, we get these words that we use citizen from these two places. That's why it's worth bringing up, right? So citizen comes from the Latin civis. They get it from the polites, which is a member of the polis. And then our word political comes from politis. And again, it kind of works out from these guys. And in Greek, as we're going to see, not just in Athens, but we're going to look more at Athens, a freeborn adult male had a legal right to participate in public and political affairs. Now this bugs some people. We'll see this when I get to the end of the Athens part. So we're like, oh, Athens wasn't a democracy. Why do you say that? Because every inhabitant didn't get to vote. They never said every inhabitant should get to vote. They said every citizen should get to vote. And you and I can be mad because the females were not considered citizens and find that discriminatory, but we can't say that they were somehow not pulling off the democracy that they claimed. They laid out the definition. This is the citizens, and every citizen gets to participate. So just keep that in mind. Don't bring your modern definitions and concepts back in time and then try to hold them accountable based on something that you and I would probably struggle with in the process. All right, so the Greeks around city-states, again, they're part of the very small. It's a better kind of structure. If you've been to Athens, you see this most in Athens. You see in other places, there's kind of like this Why are hilltops good? They're good for defense in this process. And here's where we get a core idea connected to governance of the people. This phrase here. In fact, I've had people ask me at different times to help them understand, what should we think about when we think about the concept of either republic or democracy, which, as I'm going to show you, are two distinct things. And hopefully everybody here knows you do not live in a democracy. You live in a republic. I'm going to show you in a minute, but just make sure you don't be that person. But when you say that, what's going on there? And it is for both Athens and for Rome, the idea of an invested citizen. So there's a citizen, we just said, adult male, but there's this idea of you've invested in the place. And so this is kind of core for both these groups as they're thinking of this new structure. So for the Greeks, it starts with their military. The idea was that they had a certain set of warriors that they would have, and all the different city-states had these. And in their way of doing it, the people who were involved could be involved in this group, paid for their own gear. Now, immediately you should be thinking, well, that seems like it's going to leave some people out. And the answer is yes, it would have. And then we might say, well, wouldn't the city want to have a larger military? I think the answer to that should be yes, but they didn't. All right, so in general terms, they didn't, and it's possible that they had some units that were included in the army, but they weren't part of the hoplites. So that they were a different unit. But the point for you and me is not the military, but the citizenry. What began to unfold as you went along was this concept that the citizen who paid to defend the country should have agency in the decision-making of the country. And that's the novel idea. That had just simply not occurred to them. And so these various city-states began to work out strategies and ways that they could make this happen. In other words, the logic of it seems to make sense. The person who is investing in the success and the continuation of this civic entity, having then agency into the final future decision making, you go, yeah, that makes sense. And the corollary makes sense. The person who doesn't invest anything, look, just be glad we're not kicking you out, all right? You can stay here, but you don't get to say anything. We're not going to let you participate, not because we hate you, but because you have cared so little that you do not wish to invest. And that's cool, you don't have to. But then don't get mad when we're making decisions and we're not asking you. It's that kind of a thought process as they're kind of working their way through. Now we'll focus here on the Athenians. And the Athenians kind of come to us kind of moving through this story. And it begins here, as you can see here, in 621 with Draco. That's where Harry Potter, the name, comes from. And so this is where the word draconian comes from. He wrote the first set of rules, which today we call constitutions. And looking back, they seem relatively harsh, although when you put them up against the Hammurabi Code or some of the law codes we have for the Hittites, they're not that overly harsh. All of those are harsher than what you and I would expect in a modern sense of what's good law, and we know this phrase, no cruel and unusual punishment. So we look at those, but nonetheless, it was this idea that there were a strict set of laws written and clearly defined, and Draco imposes them. And so this begins to be this idea of drawing the circle around Athens, of saying, who are the citizens, who gets to decide? And then as the laws in this case are very strict, it shouldn't be too hard to understand. At this point, there's no participation. So then if you're one of the citizens, particularly if you're a citizen who has some money, you might think to yourself, I don't like this law, and why do you get to make it in a way that I don't get to participate in the decision making of the severity of the law? So Draco's in charge. He then goes, and I put this up here again just to make sure you can kind of see comparing it to Solon. Solon becomes the next key leader, 594 BC. He reforms the Constitution and begins to switch it out by noting that we're going to have eligibility based on property. Solon, if you Google like Athenian democracy, Solon's name comes up. It shouldn't. It's a name on the journey. Had the Athenians stopped with Solon, we would be talking about something other than a democracy. Arguably, when you compare it to where the Romans ended up, I would suggest that they ended up at the same place as Solon. So, there's some participation. There's a way that the commoners do have a voice. The meetings were now moved to an open spot where everybody who was a citizen could participate. And so this was a movement away from the power pyramid kind of structure where one guy makes the decisions to a setting where more people were allowed and invited in to participate. But again, it's not what we would call democracy. And it was quite significant, the changes. But here's one of the big places, so just look down here, is that he establishes an assembly. They called it the ecclesia. And it was from the top 2 social classes. So again, it's not like open to everybody, right? It's not like that kind of a thing. And he established a council of 400. You and I sometimes, I know people who think of the council of 400 as maybe that's like our House of Representatives. Not really. What the council of 400 did was they set the agenda that was then decided upon by the ecclesia. So now you again can see decision making now being handled by a broader group of citizens, not by the sole leader or by this small little council. Right? That makes sense for everybody? This will last till he dies. He's followed by Pisistratus. Pisistratus is an interesting person in the journey. He doesn't further Solon's reforms. He doesn't really recede Solon's reforms, although he's often held up by the Athenians as a tyrant. That's always a tricky word for a lot of us because we immediately think of 20th century dictators and that kind of a thought process. It's not really fair. What they're saying with tyranny or tyrant is they're just thinking of a person who is regressing away from more inclusion, but not eliminating inclusion. He doesn't change any of Solon's real significant things. They still have the ecclesia. And one of the things he does is he puts more public works in, and he also is more interested in the rural community that the ones who lived outside of the direct walls of Athens, could and perhaps should be included in the process. And so he will do this, and you can see he does a lot of things here, and again, more focus on the rural poor. But when he died, he structured it so his 2 sons would take over. If there is a moment in this story of moving to the Athenian democracy, and we're not spending a lot of time here, we're just kind of going quickly, it is his sons who perhaps are the most guilty of not wanting to go forward on the journey that we're traveling on. Their sons are Hippias and Hipparchus, and again, there's a lot more here which we're not focused on. But the key part that involves these guys is that it is their coming post their dad Pisistratus, who, you can say it this way, it's like the citizens now have been around since Draco, have seen more inclusion, and these 2 are definitely retracting the inclusion. And worse, they're inviting their enemies in. They're inviting Sparta to come in. So Sparta and Athens hate each other. They're the great rivals. There's a long, long story in that process. And so the fact that these guys are doing this, I would suggest, is awakening in the people the sense of, well, wait a minute. I like the movement we were going to more inclusion. That's the thought that's going on there. And that takes us to Clisthenes. And you'll see Clisthenes' name if you go to Athens written with a K, but we always do it with a C. And it is in his time. Whoops, did I skip too far? I did. There we go. I didn't. Okay. So he comes in, and it's a longer story again, that's the point. And ultimately, when he is there, the people will rise to kind of fight against the Spartans. So the people rising, that's the key part, because that leads us to the word we know. So the demos kratos is this word we have, which is the people rule. So when the people rise, not at Clisthenes' leadership, like rise up, but they rise up on their own, you can see the core concept of democracy. That it is the people having the rulership or the agency for, here's the phrase, all decision making. Just on that phrase alone, you go, okay, well, that's definitely not us. So just get that in your head, right? So just move that off to the side. But what is a democracy? Oh, okay, so we want to check and see what they do. And you can see some of the changes that they move. He actually begins to shift it so that it moves from family and tribe to location. So think of it as neighborhoods. a little easier to think of Central Florida versus Winter Park, but you've got Isleworth, and you've got Maitland, you've got Winter Park, and you've got Christmas, and you've got Winter Garden, and you know all these places, right? And some are actual cities, and some are just like Castleberry. There's sort of, that's a city, and then there's other places like College Park that's just a place. You get it, right? So instead of voting coming by tribe, it comes by place, and there's actually some action where they basically mingle citizens away from their family tribes into a new geographic location of the city, so that their allegiance would shift from my tribe, my people, to my city, my nation. That makes sense for everybody. The citizenship now extended to all males, and notice the shift from where we began relative to the idea of the invested citizen with the hoplite army. No economic or property restrictions for holding office. So if you were male, you were 18, you were a citizen. If you were 17, you were male, you weren't a citizen. You didn't get to be participating in what's going on. And then he expands, now here it is, Clisthenes, working with the people, comes up with a structure that kind of matches this viewpoint. So you can see all decision making now went to the ecclesia. Every citizen is invited. The best equivalent for you and me, and we have the capacity now. We're alive in the first time where we actually could become a democracy if you think it's a good idea, because we all have a device, and the government could give us all a device in which we'd be voting on everything. Because the simple way that I like to tell people once we reach here is, in a democracy, all the citizens, not all the people, all the citizens vote on all the issues all the time. Every citizen is allowed to vote on every issue every time. Doesn't matter what it is. It's a rule change. It's a flags at half-mast question. It's a go-to-war question. All the citizens vote on all the issues all the time. And we now have the capacity to do that. Whether it's a good idea or not, I'll leave that in your hands. But so that's what they're doing. Now, if just think about the example. Will everybody pick up their phone? The way how big as we are, our phone would never stop blowing up, right? Every freaking 5 minutes we have to vote on something. And you might go, no, I'm at the movies, I'm turning this bad boy off, and I'm just not going to vote. That's your choice as a citizen. So you could choose not to come to the ecclesia, but that's on you. That's not the rules. You're allowed to come and vote. One of the things that I like to point out to my students, at least, is this one. If you live in a society that is the typical normative state where it's the power pyramid, you're not included in the decision making. Decision making about the judicial activities of your neighbors is something you should care about. But of course, in a power pyramid, I don't want you to speak to it, because I'm going to decide whether Paul gets beat or not. That's the end of the story. I and my small little, crew of leaders, we don't want you, whining about X, Y. In fact, if you start whining, I'll just kill you too. And then unless you're whining, and everybody knows not to whine, because I have made my point. But think about the last time you or a friend got the summons for jury duty. Did you celebrate and look forward to it, or did you quickly try to find any possible way out of it? If you've tried to find any possible way out of it, you are betraying the fact that you either don't understand what it means to be a citizen, or you do not like being a citizen, which is your right. But then please never ever complain about any governing decisions ever made, because you've said, I don't want to participate. Societies throughout the world, even today, would be thrilled to be included in a governing position where they could dictate to the state what would happen for this individual or that individual in this legal case. So it's an interesting thing. That's not a new change for us. I remember hearing my parents, people could moan in the 70s and the 60s about jury duty. Okay, notice also that most people would be expected to be in public office often. So you had people in public office, and their courts, look, 200 citizens, sometimes 500 citizens. So not this 6 and 12. When did we go to 6 for the jury? My wife was just on jury duty. She said, there's 6 of us. I'm like, when did that happen? Okay. All right. So there's the Greeks. There's the Athenians. Kind of a summary statement here. So the Athenians kind of move this way. They're the only ones who go that far. The other city-states have variations of government citizen inclusion. Some don't have it at all. We'll come back to the Athenians, because I'll make a point for us. The Romans are going to go in a different version of governance of the people. If you do want to think of republic and democracy as close cousins. You can do that. They're not synonyms, but they're close cousins. And what you're really saying is this phrase, government of the people. Both are government of the people types. And so there may be other types that somebody could argue would be government of the people. That's a different conversation. So the Romans, they again, like at Athens, were the typical power pyramid type of story. They had a king. You got, of course, the whole Romulus and Remus story in the background. They definitely had the power pyramid. They did have a senate that was really the elite families who got to be in this place. They had no real agency. So again, an example of a power pyramid, the guy at the top with a small little cadre of people who kind of make the decisions and sort of explain things as they're going along and making the vote. Well, then the system was split into these groups. So there were patricians, they're the guys in the Senate, then this is the rest of us, the plebeians. And if you were slaves, you have no rights. So that would have been true everywhere. So the Spartans are heavily led and constructed by a slave-based system. So slavery, again, slavery is a worldwide concept, just around the world. It's never about race, it's always about power. And for the rich, being able to have people do their jobs for them is kind of a cool thing, is the way they want to do things. But this all leads to the crisis here with Lucretia, she's the wife of a governor, and she gets raped. So she comes to the Senate and says, I was raped. And it's not so much the rape part, it's the part of being, I think, forcibly taken advantage of by the king, because she's one of the elite, right? So she's already privileged, right? So you don't have a lot to complain about. So it's that sense of the injustice of autocratic rule. And then she commits suicide. And that then leads mostly Brutus, Lucius Junius Brutus, who himself was part of the elite, to say, we need to fix this. So they overthrow the monarchy. They call in the plebeian peoples. Now again, don't think of, like, it's hard for a lot of us to get this scope. I mean, even Winter Park, 30,000 people, that's a lot of people, right? When you think of the numbers, right? But you can do it in our minds easier in Winter Park than you can, say, in the United States, or even in Orange County with, or Orange, Central Florida with its, 3 or so million people in the process. But so the elite are going to make this change. They call in regular folks like me. Hey, come, we're going to have this conversation. And they explain it to them. They're here at the forum. And they say, look, we're going to do something different. And what do they do that's different? They are going to construct a system in which the public things, or the things pertaining to the people, will be under the guide or the leadership of the people. So res publica, the things of the people, are going to be managed by the people. But we would say it's managed, or the participation is in an indirect way. So remember, in Athens, all the citizens can vote on all the issues all the time. In a republic, the citizens rarely vote on anything, but they vote on representatives who vote on things. So they're passing off the ability for decision making to individuals, and then I'm going about my life. I don't want my phone blowing up. You said you want your phone blowing up. So good, you're the one, you do it. I voted for you, right? That's the idea in the process. And it was largely supported. Now, it's important when we look at the Romans, and again, there's a much longer story here, which we're not going to get lost on. But when you look at the Romans, they're going to spend over 200 years navigating the rules and concepts around what republic means. So it's not like they got it from, Zeus on high and wrote it down and chiseled it in some stone and that's the end. It's a negotiated thing. So I say that sometimes because I think some Americans get frustrated, or citizens of the United States, because they like to pretend that we wrote something in 1787 or we passed the 14th Amendment in 1866 and ta-da, the end. And the Romans are an example for us, I think, that if we would learn from the Romans, because that's who we're modeled after, as we're going along, finding out that there needs to be some shifting or restructuring around the rules of how we do this thing have merit. So the Romans are the first to get there, but they spend all this time kind of thinking their way through the process. They kept the Senate. It was still initially only the patricians. That will change over time. They did the most unique thing, although the Spartans sort of did the same thing first, except here it's elected, is that they elected 2 leaders. So just imagine we have 2 presidents right now. So don't think of president, vice president, but 2 presidents that are elected. And they rule at the same time for only 1 year. They were not supposed to ever repeat. So For us, sometimes we think 4 years is not enough, or we struggle about that. And I think there's a whole other conversation about like what that number should be in our current time and space. And again, when I say current time and space, I'm thinking the last, say, 75 years. We're more modern, technology, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, the Romans, 1 year, and you roll off, and you don't get reelected. So the leadership moving through a lot of people, which again mimicked what the Athenians did, where citizenship office holder at a variety of levels was going to move quickly every year or two. And so you participating, having to do it, often is expected. And this is one of the things that our founders were thinking. It did not work out this way. And Madison is an example early of how it didn't work out this way. So it's not like we've done anything. But that's why they were thinking 2 years only for House Representatives. Because I think had you asked them, including Madison in 87, what do you think is going to happen here? They'd be like, well, every 2 years, we'll get somebody new. And that's why they sort of split it up. So, anyway, you get the point there. Move and change, move and change, move and change, move and change. Which is why they thought, the Senate, they're the upper house, they probably need a little bit more stability, so we'll make it every 6 years. But they still, at least on paper, in their planning stages, were not anticipating anybody would want to do it. And perhaps the main reason they wouldn't want anybody to do it is the same thought was happening here is, I could maybe have my job hook me up for a year of like, keep my job while I do this for the city, but I'm coming back in a year because I need my job and I want to do my job. My job's this thing. This thing is me serving the people. I don't really want to do this, but I'll do it for my turn. And then I want out. There's a missing piece in this that some of you are thinking about, that how power corrupts. So that's a whole other piece that I think we could argue with the structural people who are writing these systems and these plans. And so then they had other groups at various assemblies that kind of moved through over the time. You can see again, here's this 200 years I'm talking about. They'll set up a whole bunch of assemblies. Early on, the plebeians will do their own thing. This is where the main idea of the Romans having a senate and an assembly. I mean, technically, the Romans have like 4 different assemblies, so it's actually a very complex system. But keeping it simple for me, and maybe for you, there's the senate, there's the assembly, and then out of the assembly comes sort of a matching power figure to match the consuls. It's the tribune. So this is different than the military thing I told you that we mentioned earlier with Paul. And so this is an elected official. And you can see eventually the tribune will gain veto power. Veto from the Latin, I forbid. So he gets veto power over the Senate. And if by the time you roll all the way through, they're going to write their laws. I'll come back to this in a second. But you roll down to 287, the Hortensian law is passed then, so 200 years from where we started. Monarch, republic with Senate, king with Senate, consuls with Senate, all the power. Then an assembly. Go forward another 150 years or so, and now the assembly, they're the ones who approve all the decisions. So it's like you can see the power shifting to the plebeian peoples, having their representatives in the assembly making the final voting decisions on all things. Like today, our system is designed that the president signs off, but imagine that's where we started with Washington, and today in the 21st century, the Speaker of the House has to sign off as a representative of the House Representatives. I'm not saying that's a good idea, I'm just trying to help you see what that would look like, the president now still being there, but never able to finalize and enact laws, no executive actions, none of that kind of stuff, because where's the power lie? It lies with House Representatives and their leader, the Speaker of the House, in that process. Remember, there's no system where the citizens voted in decision making. They voted for representatives. Okay, everybody good? Groovy. Again, invested citizenship. Theirs is more connected to land than connected to military stuff. It'll be them that we in the United States borrow from when you get to the United States and you see all the colonies having voted connected to land rights, citizenship tied to land. Do not think of that as an elitist ownership financial thing. I understand if you say, but that's how it works out. I got you. But the idea was, again, how do you show you want to be invested in the decision making of Winter Park? You buy land here because you can't take the land with you. If you don't want to buy land here, groovy, nobody's going to make you, but then don't act like you should get to vote here. You've not invested in here. Now that'd be problematic in Carl's opinion today because we're in a very urban society nationwide, very difficult to buy anything in most urban cities, the cost and all that kind of stuff. So that's a whole different conversation whether we should be emphasizing in our country today the idea of invested citizen. What would be the proper descriptions of invested would be something we'd have to talk our way through. But can you see the point of where they're going? And if you know the city of Cincinnati, you know George Washington's history in the society of Cincinnati, it all goes back to this guy. Who's this example of what they mean? A guy minding his own business. There's a war that threatens the nation. He voluntarily sacrifices and leaves his farm and family, goes and serves, is asked to be the king, asked to be the leader, rejects all that, goes back home. You see that Washington was really modeled on that, or he really wanted to mimic that when he famously gave his sword back after the war was over. And then famously, once we did the second governing system, he's like, look, I have no kids and I'm not going to stick around. And you know, they forced him into a second re-election, which he famously always said, I only regretted my decision once every day for the second term. And then after the end of the second term, when he was still healthy, he still could have kept going. He's like, freaking no, I'm out. And so he left. And so that model of turning down power, as you and I both know, that's pretty rare in the process. So when you compare them, right, Athens did it quicker, Rome went longer, indirect, direct, these are the differences. Clear separation of powers. Here, all the citizens are allowed, they don't have to, vote on all the issues. Nowhere did every inhabitant, we talked about that already, so keep those two separate in your head. The difference between somebody who's just living there, or in the case of a woman who's over 18, you know, that she's not considered a citizen in the process. And again, we can debate that with the Athenians and say, well, that's not fair. But that's not, they would have said that's not the point. So this idea of citizenship, though, then becomes interesting when you look at Rome, because we know Rome's the one that gets bigger and expands, and then eventually changes from a republic to an empire. When we read that about Paul, it's at the time of empire. So they're not a republic, but they still have kept this idea of citizen. Right? So it's kind of a concept. And it really begins early for the Romans. Once they've gone from their little city, they conquer first the Latins, they eventually conquer all the other people, tribal groups on the peninsula. They will kind of develop that whole thing that today we call Italy. As they do that, questions begin to get raised really early. In fact, when you get to that Hortensian Law in 280, a lot of development's already occurred in conquering. So what do we do with these people? And the short answer is they don't solve this well, which is one of the reasons why when you look at the decline and the fall of the Republic in the time of the first century, what happened? There's a lot of things that happened, but one of the key ones is that they never renegotiated and redeveloped their constitution to take into effect this larger entity, particularly after the Punic Wars. So they conquered, you know, Tunisia, that part of North Africa that's close to where Sicily is, and then landed the Iberian Peninsula, and they were in the process of conquering the lower part of Gaul, and then Julius Caesar will conquer Gaul. So all of a sudden they're taking over a lot of land. Well, who are these people? Are these people allowed to vote? Are they participating? Where does that get into? And again, remember the soldier saying he bought his citizenship? So the challenge here, or the point for you and me, is that you can see that there's a legal relationship with the state, with the nation, and it continues to move as to where is Rome. So you see this in the United States, where the 13 colonies. There were the 13 colonies over to the Mississippi, but not Florida. There were Florida, then Texas, then Louisiana with Louisiana Purchase, then Texas. So we're taking all these lands as you go along. You know, where is this thing? It'd be like you having your house, and then you add on, you buy the neighbor after they move, you buy their lot, and then now extend your house to include their lot. So, you know, where is your house in the process? The Romans called this jus lati, which of course connects back to the Latin concept that this had a qualified citizenship. So the Latins were the first conquered, so they wanted to include them. They weren't Roman. Roman is a thing, Latin is a thing. It's two separate things. So they wanted to include them in the citizen structure, in the process. And then they began to keep, as you can see, they're extending it to other conquered peoples. People who fought in the army, that was an opportunity for citizenship to be gained. Land ownership, always an opportunity from the idea of investing in the citizenship. So Rome is a place local, and the idea of Rome extends. So it extends as they're successfully conquering. So then you could be living in Rome, but would you be a citizen or not depends on decisions that were either afforded to you or that you made as you went along in the process. Now, before we get to the United States, one more piece, and I think it's really important. This is really more about the governing system than about citizen per se, but I think they're linked. And think about what I said to you earlier about your response to jury duty, right? These systems of government are very, very hard to hold. I would suggest the number one reason, and I don't think I have it even written up there, but the number one reason it's hard to hold is, this is going to be harsh, and I'm thinking of Carl, but by extension you, is we're lazy. And we have a daddy complex. Meaning, it's easier for me if dad just does it for me. Pay my bills, wash the dog, fold my clothes. It's just easier. And then I can do the things I want to do. And if you think about going to the hillside to listen on a weekly or maybe bi-weekly place for 3 or 4 hours, I mean, how many of you ever go to city governance or county governance to just be there? Not because you have a reason, just to go. Carl doesn't. So, I mean, some people do, but most don't. Why not? And it's because, well, I chose them to do it. And I'm glad they're doing it. You guys do it. Tell me if there's something big you need my opinion on. Otherwise, and I'm not saying that that makes me evil or stupid or bad, or certainly not saying that about yourself. But it's easy to say I want governance of the people, and it's actually very difficult to do, and particularly to do for extended periods of time. And then other factors come involved, right? So for the Athenians, they faced external pressure that ultimately, they won, obviously, the Persian Wars, but that changed the dynamics of the city. And if you go deeper into that, you see Athens becoming excessively rich, and in their wealth, becoming something of a bully or even a tyrant over other city-states that were around them, kind of dictating down to these people, which ultimately led to the Peloponnesian War, where Sparta's like, yeah, you ain't pushing us around. And so that led to, several, actually decades of war and disaster, which harmed everybody in the process. The Romans, theirs happens after the Punic War, so they're successful against Carthage. And as I said, one thing is you can see that they never thought, how should we restructure now that we're this much larger? I mean, we're across the equivalent in their minds of a vast ocean. And so how are we supposed to make this work at that far distance? And they weren't sure they could. In fact, this is one reason why there were some people at the time of the founding who were, one of the reasons they were so deeply opposed to the Constitution was because it was going to diminish the role of the state. And the fear was you can't do a government of the people across the scope of the current 13 colonies. It's too big, and we won't be allowed to do what's best for the people in the various regions where they are. So we should keep it small, have a loose alliance, but keep it small so the power lay with each of the individual states. So obviously today we have technology which helps us with all that, but you can kind of get the story of where they're going. So for the Athenians, between 411 and 321, they're going to lose everything. And then with the coming of the Macedonians, then Athens in essence ceases to exist as an independent place. And while the Macedonians like to claim that they were Greek, no Greek alive would consider the Macedonians Greek, and they certain were not going to, the Macedonians, change their monarchy to adopt some sort of a government of the people process. So they don't. And again, the Romans, we talked about this, they'll eventually come into Athens as part of the empire. This is actually before the empire starts. But they'll basically continue this sense of no citizenship extension or only loose citizenship extension for some people as they're going along. And then again, this is kind of the road through. There's, I believe, I always lose count. There are like 4, depends on who's counting, 4 or 5 civil wars that occur in a century amongst the Romans. And ultimately, they lose touch with their system of governance. And beginning with two guys named Marius and Sulla, you begin to see a series of, we would say, dictators, but the short version is people who did not really include the Senate or the Assembly, ran things back to that power pyramid. It's the debate amongst historians, particularly Roman historians, as to who kills the Republic. I will always say it's Octavian, but there is a fair argument to say it's Caesar, but there's a fair argument to say it really died with Marius and Sulla. It just took about 40 more years for the heart to completely stop beating. And the point again being, citizens were no longer included, but some of that, you could argue, was because the citizens did not choose to want to be involved. And they sort of just let these things happen. Okay, so post-empire. Well, the citizenship concept continues, and again, there's Paul, he has a citizenship, but the empire and the emperor takes full control. So from this point forward to its collapse, whether in the West in the 450s or in the East in the 1450s, there's no citizen involvement in what's going on. The empire is run by the emperor. And so decisions are made at the top. There's no voting of any structure in those periods of time. In the West, with the fall, you see them devolving back to some degree, initially a tribal experience. So the Germanic peoples who come in, when you typically show a map of that, you show it by tribal group instead of just saying the Germans, because it's all these different little groups of people who come in migrating for the various reasons they migrate. And then eventually, this will move into what we call the feudal system. And so the feudal system is, again, a nice little snapshot of that power pyramid type structure. And you have an elite group of families who rule various and sundry sizes. All you have to think about is Downton Abbey and the Crowley family. They've run that land for how long? When we pick up the story, the very first season, it's like 1880s or something, or 1890s. But that house and that family's been there for centuries, I think, is the way that they build out that story. Who are they? They're part of the rich elite who own all the land. And all those people that you see, if you watch Downton Abbey, the folks underground, the pig farmer, the folks in those villages, none of them are citizens. They have no agency, no voting, no participation. They don't own anything. The houses you see, the buildings you see, the places where they live, the church they go to, that is all owned by the Crowley family. So that's feudalism. The Crowleys may be nice, and the young girls who are taking over in the early 20th century are thinking of making transition. Maybe they do, I haven't seen the movie. But nonetheless, what's happening there is you see an example in the late 19th century of good old-fashioned feudalism in the process. So it's lost. So the idea of citizenry and citizen inclusion are lost. You're not a citizen, you're a subject. All those people, think of Downton Abbey, none of them are citizens. They're just inhabitants of the place. The only citizens are the folks who live on the upstairs part of the big fancy house, the family that's there. But then it begins to be recovered. This tiptoes us by, we're not going to go deep into, this tiptoes us by the Renaissance, because it is at the time of the Renaissance, although this is preceding the Renaissance when this happens. You start to see this idea coming around the redevelopment of cities. So cities begin to reemerge in the middle of the Middle Ages. And as they do, you start seeing this idea of citizen, not really from a political point of view, but certainly from the identification point of view of you live in the city. And there began to be opportunities for peasants who moved to the cities that did not exist for anybody else. So if you could get to the cities, and cities really became places of refuge to some degree. If you could sneak away, not get caught sneaking away, it's not really Underground Railroad type stuff like we know in our story and metaphor, but it's along those lines. You just couldn't just walk away and tell the noble leader, I'm out, see ya. They weren't gonna let you do that because he owned you. But if you get away, we're gonna go trading, we'll be back in 2 weeks, and then the wagon comes back with somebody, but you don't come back, and you're in this town that's 25 miles away, the noble lord coming to look for you. Maybe he might send one of his soldiers. Maybe, could they find you? Could they not find you? If you could kind of hide out there, you would gain some rights because of your identification of being a city dweller, and that's where you get this kind of connection here. And so, Venice, Florence, Pisa, Siena, these all begin to pick up and remind themselves of what the Romans had built. They do variations of this. It usually was not a large percentage, but you see this again going from the cities, where in the cities you typically did not have a town, or you did not have, a noble family who ran the show. They would exist to some degree, the cities, in independence of each other, or at times would reach out to another noble lord far, far away, that we will offer our allegiance to you if you will protect us, meaning we can use you as a threat if the more local noble lord tries to want to conquer us or take away our rights of being in this city. So you see some of those relationships kind of built along the way. And then as the Renaissance really blows up, you begin, as you move into the 1500s, to start seeing a real study done. This is what's setting the stage for what happens in the United States. You get the Magna Carta written. It's not perfect, but it gets that door open. In the Swiss cantons, you start seeing examples, again, of what they did. In the Swiss cantons, you start seeing examples of democracy, because they're very small, little isolated valleys, so they're kind of going in that direction. Up in the Netherlands, you start seeing this thing happen in 1464. And then as the Reformation is on the verge of coming in France, you start having some theorists writing about it, which will play a role in what happens there, not for the French Revolution 300 years later, but for an initial attempt to have citizens' government. It won't work. They'll lose out. But when you read some of the writings from Francois Hauptmann or Theodore Beza, it's connected to the Reformation. But you start seeing them arguing that the citizens who live in a place have the ability, again, to participate, to kind of guide and speak into the decisions that's making. They're arguing, these guys, as well as the next one I'm going to show you, they're arguing that if there is a position called a king, then you only exist because of us, the people. So it's an idea of we created you, not you created us. And if you think about that connected to modern leadership, that's the point that should be going. I'm not so sure most modern leaders understand this, but nonetheless, that's what they're arguing. And they, and Hauptmann basically argues all the way back to the Gauls who precede the Franks, and the Franks are where we get France from, that word. So, you're looking, even the Gauls are going back in the BC era, that there was an elective type setting, is what he argued. It's not clear to me that Hauptmann makes his case well, but my point to you is that he is arguing the case and trying to argue the case from their own history in the process. This all goes sideways with the coming of Henry IV. Henry IV is the guy who basically wins at the end of the religious wars, the national wars that tear apart France from the time of the 1530s till his victory in 1588-89. He's the last Henry standing in the War of the Three Henrys. I know, why can't they find new names? But that's just, they don't. They stick with the names they got. Lots of Charleses, lots of Marys. And while he initially, so you can see another one of these guys here, Mornay, is somebody who's with Beza and Hauptmann, and this, there's a moment where you think Henry IV could have been the French equivalent to William and Mary in the moment of the English writing their Bill of Rights and then moving forward. But he doesn't. He partially doesn't because he's still trying to hold the country together. A good analogy is when you look at what happened for Lincoln and Johnson and Grant during the overarching period of the Civil War. You see all three, including Lincoln, who knew it and admitted it, some stronger accumulation of power to the presidency. It's not fair, I think, to call any of them dictators. I don't think any of our presidents we've ever elected, you could use the term dictator. But there are some that come to mind that really grab onto the levers of power in a way the Constitution does not seem to support. And Lincoln does. And so if you say, well, Lincoln shouldn't have done that, and then Johnson and then Grant, why'd they do that? The argument would be Civil War. And then you kind of work out from there whether you think that's fair or not fair. You can make the same argument here for Henry, is that when maybe he should have gone further down the road of maybe some sort of representative thing, he doesn't. Why doesn't he? Because of the tensions, also economic issues. But he basically begins a journey that will go through his son Louis XIII and then into Louis XIV, to where France will move all in on absolutism. Meanwhile, for the British, they go the other direction. Their crisis really begins in the 1600s. Their theorists, which we've covered many times here before, we won't cover them again today, Hobbes and Locke mostly. One could look back to the 1500s and look at some stuff Bacon wrote in the process, but basically all saying the same sort of messaging. The people should have a voice in the struggle. This is the world of our colonists. So our colonists know all these things, the colonists in the 1600s. They know all these things, they know these people, and when you get to, for the British, to the 1689 Glorious Revolution, all of the people living in North America who are British know this. And so all the argumentation that goes forward in the 1700s, from say 1750 forward to 1776, is an argument of, I am a British citizen who has these written rights. And these rights, from my opinion, are being infringed upon or limited, and they should not be. The Americans are always making that legal brief. Again, Declaration of Independence, it's a legal brief. It's written, in that case, it's written to the judge of the world and to the world itself. But you see Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin arguing about the legalities of where their rights have been infringed. Well, what rights do you think you have, not as an inhabitant and not as a subject, but as a citizen? As a citizen, I have those rights to participate. So, you see that worked out as you look at the Americans as they're kind of developing their ideas of their colonial governments. Remember, one way to describe the Americans is 13, or 12, because Georgia gets here late, but 13 attempts or efforts or variations of citizen government. How can we do it? And they included, for the invested citizen, the idea of property ownership because property was so readily available. You almost had to choose not to own property. There still were some economic issues. There still was a lower percentage of the group who could say, I can't afford. But by and large, you could get property. So never see the American early definitions about property as any kind of an elitist thing to deny people the right to vote. That's just unfair to the evidence. We were allowing so many people to vote. No women, sorry ladies, but still, from a percentage point of view, it was very open in their idea of this kind of representative government. And so then this leads us to, again, the Declaration and this idea of citizen being expressed. And so then a way to understand the debate then that includes where we go from here for us, which we'll look at, is what does it mean to say government of the people when it's not a democracy? When you say that, how are you expressing yourself? Are you electing people that then you never have any connection with, or are you electing people that you say are part of us? So there's a lot of conversations just about the governance, which is not our topic today, that you could argue, are the representatives who represent us, whether at the city level or county or state or national, are they of us, or have they somehow moved into a different strata that they are not of us? And I think that is a deep tension that is being raised. Now it's interesting when you look at the Articles of Confederation, beyond the idea of the states having defining power, the Articles themselves do not talk about it. They kind of leave it at the states. We covered the Articles. When we get to the end, if you see the QR code, you can go to my YouTube page, you can see the videos. If you didn't get a chance to that lecture, I think it's a good one that we really kind of talk about what's going on with the Articles, and then we did another one on the Constitution itself. But so, they're basically doing this kind of friendship type thing. Again, they're rejecting democracy specifically. It's very clear when you read the founders. And so it's their best way to understand under life and other articles is like the EU. We're all in a relationship, but we're all independent. So I'm Switzerland, I can do what I want. You're Hungary, you can do what you want. You're Romania, you can do what you want. Some tie in economically or with different things. And again, the citizens are understood as being as a part of the state, and the state gets to decide what citizenry is in their area, because again, you can do what you want. But then it's just, the citizen has, again, privileges and immunities of the various states. You can go state to state, and even though you're from Massachusetts, you wouldn't be limited when you got to South Carolina in the process. Then when you get to the Constitution, interestingly, back up for a second, Madison and Hamilton and others, they thought this was not a good idea. They thought this was a defect. But then when they got a chance to do the writing, they did not change it. They did not go in and say, let's really define citizen. So they're still leaving it. I think what happened there is in all the debates and the compromises they had to work their way through, Madison ultimately decided this is not a hill to die on. We'll leave it with the state in the process. But that will then play a role And another thing he does is he kind of passes it off here in Article 1 that Congress would establish a uniform rule of naturalization. So begin the process of deciding who could be the citizen, which leads us then to what is, even today, some of you know, very contentious. We are, and we'll show you a slide at the end in a second, we are one of the few nations who use jus soli as the mechanism by which you declare citizenship, meaning where were you born? Historically, and most of the other nations around the world use jus sanguinis, which is the right of blood, meaning who were you born to? So if you're born to citizens and you weren't born on our soil, no problem. But if you were born to non-citizens on our soil, that does not make you a citizen in sanguinis. Right? Does that make sense for everybody? Mm-hmm. So we really ultimately, and I think a lot of that is because, as many of you would know to say, we are a nation of immigrants. So you have this process of people coming in and consistently being added in new, and we wanted a way to include it. We don't deny this one, the right of blood, but because that's why if you may know somebody who was born abroad, they are automatically a U.S. citizen. They're not a citizen. They have to go through some process when they come back from their vacation, where they might have a mission field, they might have gone doing some business work for a couple of years. Note that it is still something that they focused on free white persons. And here they don't declare males, which raises questions, and there will be issues for women's inclusion through the late 18th century, but that's basically shut down by the early 19th century in the United States. And then people of color were, and certainly Native peoples were not included in any of this story at the beginning. So then this leads us to a series of court cases that I just want to show you, where you can see citizenship being raised, which takes us into the Civil War. One involving the Native Americans, the Cherokee Nation, the other involving Dred Scott. So in both of these cases, which have their own unique context, which we're not going to get into, the question before the court is, what is their standing in the court? Meaning, do they have the right as a citizen to press their claim of something being done to them? Some of you have traveled, you know you do not have the right of a citizen in this other country you visited to if you get crossways with the authorities. It's not a good idea, and if you've ever gone anywhere, particularly if you've gone anywhere dangerous, one of the things you're told to do is make sure you have the phone number of what? The U.S. Embassy. Why? Because you're not a citizen there, and if you get in trouble, they don't care. They probably do care, not that they're evil, but you get the point. And who should you call? Who's your lawyer call? To the U.S. Embassy. I'm a U.S. citizen. Help me out. That's the phone call you're making. Why? Because I'm not a citizen of France. I'm not a citizen of Afghanistan or China or Iraq or Zambia or wherever, Argentina. So I've done something wrong, or they've arrested me. I need help. I don't have any rights or privileges here. My only rights or privileges is that I'm a citizen of the United States. Help me. Right? Does that make sense? So in both cases, the court ruled that they were not citizens. Both cases are very frustrating for modern Americans. We don't like these cases. But it's interesting for us to see pre-Civil War, the standing of the court, two separate groups on the court, making this generally similar case. You're not a citizen. As no citizen, you have no standing here. If you know your Cherokee Nation issue, you know that once this case was decided, they came right back with a second case, but you know it was put forward by some Methodist missionaries who were working on Cherokee soil, and they, as U.S. citizens, tried to press the case that the state of Georgia was acting illegally to the Cherokees, and we got wrapped up in it, and that's the case where the court, led by Marshall, ruled in favor, not of the Cherokees, but really of the Cherokees in connection with these two American citizens. And then Jackson famously, though it's probably apocryphal, said, well, the court's made its ruling, the court can enforce it, meaning I'm not going to enforce it. In Taney's case, or Dred Scott, Chief Justice Taney says, look, not a citizen, can't have, and not only he can't have, people of African descent can never have rights of a freeborn citizen. It's one of the crucial moments when you study the road to the Civil War, because for the members of and it's biracial abolition movement, they're like, this really was almost like the last straw. It's this kind of decision making that led people to take violent action, such as John Brown, to try to bring on the Civil War to kind of force things out. Okay, the war's over, and we have these questions now. What do we do now? Because we've got these 4.5, 5 million people, inhabitants who are living here. What are we going to do with them? If you don't know your Lincoln history, remember as late as 63, Lincoln was still on the boat of saying we ship them out. We find them another place to live. We'll buy the land, but they can't be here because they'll never have rights and citizenry here. That's his own view. He wasn't just saying that because Tawny said it. People like Douglas, other people, Garrison, different people were able to convince Lincoln, hey, look, man, that's not the way we're going to do it. 5 million people. And to some degree, you can see the challenges of Reconstruction happening when the slaves kind of are being asked questions about land ownership. It's a whole different conversation. But when you look at that, you get this, I feel like, energy from the African-American community to say, why we got to leave? We built this place. We're the ones that built everything. And so there's all those questions in the process. And so they will pass the 13th Amendment. Now, using Madison's logic of the Constitution, that should have automatically made all the males citizens once they own land, which then brings in Grant's decision that he made Sherman's decision as he made as the general who had conquered through the South through Georgia when he passed the general order for the military that came out what we call 40 acres and a mule. Because what it did is it gave them land ownership that they could hold, which would then have given them investment opportunity and the idea of being able to continue to vote. The Democratic Party was so vehemently opposed to this. Congress, led by what are called the radical Republicans, but they're really the real Republicans, the abolitionists, passed its 1866 Civil Rights Bill, which now makes a definition of who the citizens are. You're born here, you're declared a citizen. Wow. That then gets folded into the 14th Amendment because Republicans did not believe that that would be supported well enough in the nation at large. And they were right. I mean, even the 14th Amendment, if you studied the Reconstruction history, is not supported, and arguably in the South is not supported till you get to the 1960s, and some might argue not since then. But regardless, certainly wasn't supported. So they wanted it not to just be a Civil Rights Act, they wanted it to be in the Constitution. Now this is then the most critical moment of defining citizenry. This is why we've had a couple of talks through the whole Citizen Civics series for 3 years on just the 14th Amendment. It arguably is the most important event or amendment ever created in the Constitution because of its consequential nature. And what it does is it defines within the Constitution in a way the Constitution nor the Articles had defined, and as you can see and you know, it connects into this idea then of where you were born, not who you were born to where you were born, right of the land, as a way of defining citizenship. It's also consequential and of vital importance or impacting and shifting the Constitution, because you may remember our Constitution, you can think of our Constitution as designed to bind up and limit the government. Remember, moving from Articles to Constitution under Madison's design is taking on more power. So Madison's aware of this and aware of the criticism, and so his thought was, we'll have these kind of binding rules, and in Madison's mind, you can only do things in the Constitution, so if it's never mentioned, you can't do it. He learns later people have a different view than that, and that's why you'll see different decisions made. In the first 10 amendments that are passed, the very first one starts with, Congress shall make no law bound. The 14th Amendment, though, goes the other way and says basically Congress will defend citizen rights against who? Against the state. So it's almost like a loosening of the bounds, the bindings on the government so that it can go and act to defend citizen rights. And this is where you get this idea, this phrase, equal protection of and under the law. So this changes, there's never been a concept of citizenship, and it protects the citizen against any action from the state. Previously, we wanted to keep the United States Congress from ever acting. From this point forward, there's an expectation of Congress to act against who? Against any state that's trying to move and operate against in any way that would be seen as a limitation to the citizens. And that then kind of gives us a series of questions here related to voting, which we're not going to try to answer, but the 15th Amendment, the 15th Amendment is an unneeded constitutional amendment because the 14th Amendment gives the right to citizens for full participation. But you can see the limitation, the racism, the frustration of the time of Reconstruction, which then led Congress to say, well, we're going to pass something that clarifies. This is when you begin the question of, wait, where are women included? They won't get theirs for another 50 years, but they will be moving that direction. There was some debate about doing it at this point, and some of the African American leaders were like, let's not muddy the water, let's just do one thing at a time in the process. And then through the time since the 14th Amendment, you have a whole series of decisions that have made at the Supreme Court level that have been around citizenship. Again, I just want to point out here, once you're at this point, all three of these things that I told you are now created into this one identity of who is a citizen. Identification, privileges and protections, and then participation. They're all kind of tied in the process. And if you're interested in these, this one here, the United States versus Wong Kim Ark, 1890, this is the one that is considered really the bulwark of discussion around citizenship. Obviously, the rest of these play little roles in. Here you can see one in 2021, which plays a role in the process. But if you want to read more about the Supreme Court side of it and the debates that have gone on relative to those things, you can do that here. I want to show you this map really quickly, just so you can see how we're really in the odd position. So I know there's discussions about it, that's not our purpose here, but as you think about those questions, it's the yellow, and you can see it's most of the Americas, a few places in Africa, who follow us. Most of the rest of the world does it by the idea of only the blood. So you're not a citizen if you're born there. We do our thing in our own way in the process. Real quick, I'm going to skip all the way to the end because these are all the same thing. The founders expected the people would create through representation. So the people are included. Which people? The citizens. Who are the citizens? The invested citizens. Initially, how do I prove I'm invested? You've bought property. You own property. You're not taking property with you. You're there. There's this idea of usness. We will kind of create, again, that common moral virtue foundation kind of holds us together. And then we're going to decide who are the citizens, because this is the part of determining who are the people when we say the government of the people in the process. And this comes to us from Greece and Rome. And I'll leave this up here with Adams as we wrap it up and say citizenship is at the center of understanding a government of the people. It was the intent of many of the founders, I'd say most of the founders, to hold true to what Adams and others thought of an equality under the law. You lose that, or you get bored with the idea, you don't want to really go to jury duty, those kinds of things really raise that question of how well or lack thereof are we valuing the citizenry concept, which is at the center of what it means to be a government of the people. Who are the people? The citizens. Who gets to decide things? The citizens. Well, then who are the citizens? And how do we define that and protect it and value the status of citizen? And that's where we will end. Thank you very much. Questions? I see your hand. Go for it.
Was there any talk about who would lose citizenship?
There is. If you go back to here, to this one here, 67, Afroyim versus Russ. Congress cannot remove citizen from an individual. They must rescind it. So they're a citizen until they choose to not want to be. So as of now, that is still considered the law of the land. That nobody can pass a law to say, professors of history, you lose your citizenship. Does that make sense?
And then what about Rome and Athens? I guess you could be banned from the polis?
Only in Athens did they do an exclusion kind of process. They called it ostracism. Rome didn't do that. They would just probably kill you.
Never to be ostracized.
Yes?
How do Romans, how do those people prove their citizenship? Romans and the Greeks.
Great question. So how do citizens prove their citizenship? They would have done so because they would have been right of blood unless they had bought it. So like the soldier at the beginning who said, I bought my citizenship, he would have had paper for that. It had a piece of identification that said, I bought my citizenship. So what would have happened, and Luke doesn't tell us, is that Paul would have had to produce the evidence of his family's lineage that they were themselves Roman citizens. It's sort of no differently than if we were in a place where it was birthright or citizenship only through birthright. Your birth certificate would have to demonstrate who your parents were and that they were citizens or not citizens.
By then, they already were born all in the hospitals?
They were not born in hospitals, no, but where they would have been born, you would have been able to demonstrate who their family was. It's just that idea of your own lineage, knowing who your lineage was and where had you been. And there had been some legal mechanisms by which that would be a known capacity, or that you weren't who you said you were, that you had just moved in and you were not a citizen. Because the cities were small, the regions were small. Yes, sir?
Going back to a related topic, when they were meeting in Philadelphia talking about language for the documents, declaration and so forth, even the Constitution later, how were they presenting this in scribe form? Were they all having to go to the front to read the amendment and making edits? I mean, it must have been very cumbersome.
So how did they make the choices and how did they work their process? It was all verbal. This is why, tragically, for the Constitution in particular, we have such terrible notes. With the Declaration period, 76, we've got a better case of people taking notes, and they're almost being like a secretary who kept a pretty good record of who's saying what when. But for the Constitutional period, we don't have that. We have Madison's notes. He's not the only one, but we only have a few notes in the process. So it's a tragedy in the sense as Americans, we wish, as historians, we would wish for more information. But they would verbally talk about it, and then people making ideas might have written down a suggestion that they wanted it to be passed and that kind of a thing. And then they decide to do it or not decide to do it. And eventually it gets written down.
And then how do they turn around the final product after a session?
A scribe would have gone out and written down what was concluded. And then the next day would have been read aloud to them. Yep. Well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. We'll see you hopefully in December and then next year for the 250. Have a great. If you want to get in touch with me, you can. I'll put that up in a second. But my email is up here. You can always come and see me and tell me. And there's the QR code if you want to get to the YouTube channel.